Midday, the 9th of August, 1965. The Prime Minister of Singapore is about to announce his country's independence on live television. It ought to be a time of great celebration, but not in Singapore.
For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life.
Why was independence seen as such a disaster? Why was Singapore so reluctant to assume the mantle of nationhood? The answers lie in the island's unique history. In the first half of the 20th century, it was convulsed by the trauma of a world war and the two great political forces of nationalism and communism. Its people, who had come to the island to make money, were drawn into a struggle for the island's future. This propelled Singapore on a journey to independence that no one expected, and few believed it would ever survive. The idea that Singapore could become an independent nation-state was inconceivable 100 years ago. By 1900, Singapore's port had made it one of the most cherished outposts of the British Empire. In just 80 years, it had been transformed from a swampy jungle clearing into the world's 7th busiest harbour. The British had created the boom town, and their right to rule went unquestioned. Indeed, many local businessmen and community leaders openly helped the British with the day-to-day running of the colony. In July 1901, some of them were invited to Singapore's town hall for the social event of the year. The local elites typically came from Malay, Indian and Chinese families. Many had been working with the British for generations.
These people were very happy to be of service to the British because they didn't expect to take over or to be leaders. They were not nationalists in that period. So the relationship was a very comfortable one.
The wealthy and well-connected had gathered to watch the first ever cine-film to be shown on the island. Footage from the funeral of Queen Victoria, mother of the empire.
Hardly anybody could remember a time when Victoria had not been on the throne in England. And so it did symbolise the end of an age, and particularly coming about the turn of the century as well. This was the death of somebody who symbolised what the empire and the growth of the empire and the growth of the trade and the growth of Singapore's trade meant.
But out on the streets of Singapore were thousands of recent arrivals who had never even heard of Queen Victoria. Drawn by the chance to make their fortune, some came from elsewhere in the Malayan archipelago, others from India and the Middle East. But most came from China and headed for Singapore's Chinatown. It was here that the island's unlikely journey to independence would begin. Many came here to escape famine and civil war in mainland China. They found work as labourers, noodle hawkers and rickshaw coolies. Among men such as these, the first sparks of nationalism would flicker to life in Singapore. But few had any plans to put down roots, for the time being.
Chinatown in the early 1900s would have been packed by Chinese immigrants. Their allegiance was not to Singapore. Singapore was a workplace. Their allegiance was to their hometown or home villages in China.
Despite this, by 1900, the number of Chinese swelled to a level that has remained unchanged to this day. Racially, Singapore was nearly three-quarters Chinese. But geographically, it was an island at the heart of the Malay world. In the turbulent decades ahead, people would be forced to question their loyalties. Where was home? China, Malaya, or Singapore itself? Singapore's fortunes as a port city have always depended on it being open to goods and people from across the world. But with this trade came an invisible cargo: ideas. Political ideologies imported from elsewhere can circulate in the open culture of a port city. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the big idea shaping the world, and with it Singapore, was nationalism. The seeds of Singapore's own independence originated in a struggle unfolding far to the north. In 1911, a nationalist revolt swept aside China's imperial past. It became a modern republic under revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen.
Sun Yat-sen was one of the first to articulate the idea that China should become a great power like England, France, or America, or Germany, and so on, and that the way to do it was through nationalism.
When news of his nationalist victory reached Singapore, its impact was greatest among the poorest classes. Their pigtails had long been a symbol of their subservience to the Chinese emperors. Some chose to have them chopped off. Wearing pigtails on the streets of Chinatown was no longer safe. Intoxicated by their new freedom, gangs of young men imposed their nationalist fervor on others.
They were excited about the political future of China, so they started getting organized into groups, talked about politics, and here we see the start of a politicization of the Chinese community in Singapore.
But this political awakening was yet to take hold among the Chinese elite in Singapore. Known as the Straits Chinese, they had lived in the region for generations. Many spoke Malay rather than Chinese, and often had closer links to the British Empire than the Chinese mainland. The Lee family of Kampong Java Road was typical. They were deeply Anglophile and named their son Harry. He would later lead Singapore to independence and become known to the world as Lee Kuan Yew. But as a youngster, his outlook was very Straits Chinese.
I was sent to a Chinese school, and I suffered for a few months. I thought I didn't understand the teachers and didn't feel comfortable. And persuaded my mother to transfer me to an English school, English language school, which she did. I had to learn British Empire history, I learned British Empire geography. It was quite a remarkable imperial system.
But by the 1930s, British military power in the region was outdated and dangerously overstretched. It was a vulnerability that official propaganda was at pains to mask.
With simple ceremony, the biggest graving dock in the world was named after King George VI, among those present being the British Navy.
It was imagined as a great bastion. The naval base itself was very impressive. The trouble is that there weren't any ships in it. The army was only intended to hold the fort until such time as the British Navy came to the rescue.
But the British in Singapore had no idea their days on the island were numbered. Even in 1937, when Japan invaded China, it made little impact on the colonial masters. But when news of the suffering reached Singapore's Chinatown, it reignited feelings of nationalism. Only now, it had a potent new enemy on which to focus.
There was a very angry reaction amongst the Chinese population in Singapore. They organized themselves to raise funds to support the fight against Japan. They sang songs of protest. But more importantly, they tried to hit Japan where it hurts by boycotting the cheap Japanese goods that were coming into Singapore at that time.
Those involved in anti-Japanese activities felt safely protected behind Britain's legendary defences. They were confident that Japan would never dare strike back. But in December 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Just hours later, they set their sights on Singapore.
I was in the dormitory about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. The bombs dropped. And the war had begun.
The siren sounded. I ran out to the field, wanted to see the aeroplane. Very excited about it. It was the first time. I could hear the sound of the engine. And then the all-clear siren sounded. I saw the house crumble down because of the bomb. I saw people lying on the street, those who died, those who were injured, and all the paramedics were there trying to assist those who were injured, to carry them to hospital. It was a gruesome sight. People were crying around, people were scared, and people were running here and there, helter-skelter. They don't know, they were just panicked.
That same morning, 500 miles to the north, Japanese troops landed in Malaya. As they raced down the peninsula, line after line of Allied defences crumbled. With the Japanese closing in on Singapore, a decision was made by the island's governor of great symbolic importance. Arms were issued to the Malay, Chinese and Indian communities. Men who just weeks before had been hawkers and rickshaw coolies stood as the equals of the British. They prepared to die in defence of an island which few until then had truly thought of as home. Singapore braced itself for the Japanese onslaught. In February 1942, they crossed the narrow straits from Malaya. The island's defenders were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. More than a century after Raffles first raised the Union Jack over the island, the British surrender was undignified and unconditional.
The fall of Singapore was of enormous symbolic importance to the British and to everybody else. That this was something that was absolutely unexpected was a tremendous psychological shock.
The Japanese were quick to make a public example of the island's former masters.
From City Hall, the prisoners of war were forced to walk to Changi prison. The Japanese told us village folk to stand by the roadside in order to shame the white men who had once been the big masters, the managers, bosses, important people. Now they had become the small people, lowly. The white men had fallen, the Japanese had risen.
As the island's new masters got their bearings, they proclaimed a common Asian brotherhood. They wanted Singapore's Malays and Indians to become loyal subjects of the Japanese emperor. But for those who had dared oppose Japan's invasion of China, they had something altogether different in mind. The Chinese of Singapore would be singled out for punishment so brutal, it would change the course of the island's history. Chinese males from every walk of life were taken to screening centers across the island. A process of purging, suk ching, was underway. One of those brought in was 19-year-old Harry Lee.
They allowed us to come out, line after line, and there would be some, I suppose, their informers, and then some were taken aside. They asked me to leave the pack, to join a certain group, where other young men were going. I felt unease. I said, oh, this is bad, because I was a tall, lanky youth. I said, oh, they must think that I'm a soldier, and I wasn't. So I said, would you mind if I go collect my things? So they said, yes, go ahead. So I went back and laid low.
The new masters were determined to root out those who had been involved in anti-Japanese activities. Those identified were taken to isolated spots around the island. As a young boy, Muhammad Anis lived in a village near one of the sites.
From the back of my house, I could hear the noise of trucks, making me think, is there more fighting breaking out? Then, after the commotion of the trucks, there was suddenly silence. The silence was followed by the sound of gunfire. I heard screaming and loud orders in Japanese for the shooters to hurry up. It was all noisy for a short space of time. Then silence.
Estimation later was we dug up the skulls and the bones. Somewhere between 50,000 to 100,000 young men, Chinese.
Some who survived the massacre joined bands of guerrillas fighting the Japanese in the jungle. Others endured 3.5 more years of Japanese occupation in Singapore.
The first thought was, how do we get rid of these Japanese who were unbearable, insufferable, cruel, brutal? But it was a real-life lesson on what power means to the economy of a country and the lives of its people. That if you controlled a country by force and the lives of the people depended upon you, you can make them comply, you can even change their attitudes to you, at least openly. make them comply.
The dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in August 1945 brought the war to an abrupt end. Within a month, the British had returned to Singapore. At City Hall, they took the formal Japanese surrender.
Well, I was here that afternoon, 12 August 1945, with hundreds of people. When they saw the generals marching past with their guards, looking downcast, they shouted at them, "Bagero, Bagero." Bagero means bloody fool in the Japanese language. Everybody joined in. Huge crowd, they said, "Bagero, Bagero, Bagero," many, many times, until they went into the room.
But of the Japanese who had committed war crimes, very few were executed. Most were simply deported by the British. This incensed the Chinese community. They felt the Japanese spilling of so much Chinese blood on Singapore soil had given them a moral claim to the island that hadn't existed before the war.
It was the catastrophic consequences of the war that changed mindsets, that my generation decided, no, this doesn't make sense. We should be able to run this as well as the British did, if not better.
Exhausted and impoverished by the war, Britain had lost its appetite for empire. Behind the sober facade of the Colonial Office, a radical plan for the region was being drawn up. For over a century, the British administration of Singapore had been closely entwined with that of neighbouring Malaya. But now, their futures would diverge. While Parliament decided that Malaya would be groomed for independence, Singapore was to remain a crown colony for the foreseeable future. The question of the island's relations with Malaya would come to dominate in the decades ahead. But for the time being, the debate was once more overtaken by events in China. In 1949, Mao Zedong set China on course to a communist future. Hailed by the masses as a great leap forward, his victory was to send shockwaves across Asia. By the early 1950s, communism had come one step closer to Singapore. In the jungles of Malaya, Chinese guerrillas, who had fought the Japanese during the war, had set their sights on the British. A costly, low-level war ensued. It was not long before communist agitation spilled over into Singapore itself.
Flames consume the great Eco rubber factory in Singapore, marked for sabotage in recently captured plans of the Malayan Communist Party.
An ideological clash between communism and capitalism was set to engulf Singapore in the decade ahead. At Singapore's Chinese high school today, students are imbued with patriotism to their island nation. But under the British in the 1950s, the Chinese education system was completely separate from that of the island's masters. From the ranks of Chinese High, young idealists would emerge, imbued with the communist teachings of Chairman Mao. Two in particular stood out.
In my class was a boy named Lim Qingxiang. I was very impressed when I first met him because he was very courteous and truly sincere. China's recent successes left a very deep impact on us. Both of us were strongly against colonialism.
By now, the British had committed to introducing democracy. And the governor announced plans for Singapore's first ever mass elections. This opened up opportunities for those working within the British system, such as Harry Lee. Compared to the students of Chinese High, his educational background was a world away. He'd spent 4 years studying law at the heart of the British Empire. And while in London, he took part in student debates about the future of Singapore. Newly qualified in law, he returned home with a growing interest in politics.
When we came back, we formed a group of the people who were with us in London and said, well, let's now build a party. How do we build a party? How do you get followers?
To win an election in Singapore, now as then, winning the support of the island's overwhelming majority, the Chinese-speaking masses, is essential. And the way to do it is through addressing key issues such as income, housing and jobs. In the 1950s, the loyalty of the masses was not to the graduates of British universities. It was to the trade unions campaigning to protect their interests. Two of the most powerful union leaders were Lim Chin Siong and his friend from school, Fong Swee Swan.
We were very disciplined and were willing to make sacrifices. The advantage of a Chinese education is that we were full of ideals and were determined to reform society.
To anyone aspiring to political office, the support of trade union leaders was essential. Harry Lee had already made a key symbolic gesture by adopting his Chinese name in public, to become Lee Kuan Yew. Now he started meeting with Fong, Lim and other union leaders. In the building where film of Queen Victoria's funeral had once been shown, a new political party was launched in November 1954, the People's Action Party.
The Victoria Memorial Hall was where the PAP was born. In a way, it was a coming together of two disparate groups of people, an English-educated group of moderates and a Chinese-educated group of militants, both having the same objectives of wanting to achieve self-government and eventual political independence for Singapore.
The PAP had brought together the English and Chinese-educated into a marriage of convenience. But in the elections of 1955, cracks in their relationship would already start to appear. Lee Kuan Yew led the PAP's campaign. But on the left of the party was a rising young star who threatened to eclipse him, Chinese-speaking Lim Chin Siong.
Modest, soft-spoken, quiet. But after we got going, he was a powerful Hokkien speaker. Charismatic is the word they would use today.
Lim Chin Siong was definitely a lady's idol. I remember some women wanted to find a photo of him and have it as a keepsake.
It was quite obvious that I was not the crowd puller, nor my English-educated friends, that he was.
Although both Lim and Lee won their seats, the election victory went to the Labour Front, led by the passionate anti-colonialist David Marshall. The PAP became the main opposition party. But the PAP radicals found the parliamentary process slow and cumbersome and came up with an alternative plan. Fong Swee Swan was leader of a bus workers' union. In May 1955, he called for a strike that would tear the PAP apart.
That day, about 5:45 in the morning, the company sent out 3 or 4 buses. The strikers moved forward to try and stop the buses from reaching the road. The police came in with water hoses to spray at the strikers. You can imagine, with the ride lasting so many hours and with thousands involved, even the police lost control.
The bus riot was followed by more waves of violence that whipped up public support for the radical wing of the PAP.
Lee Kuan Yew saw what the left-wing pro-communists in his party were capable of. They had infiltrated the trade unions, they were prepared to take direct action, mobilize the ground. But at the same time, he realized that he could not alienate them from the party because they had direct access to the grassroots supports upon which the PAP was dependent.
I was quite clear on which side I was on. The question was, how do I stay faithful to my beliefs and not be seen by the grassroots supporters that I'm betraying my fellow party workers? That was my problem.
For the moderates, hope lay with the British, who were still in charge of internal security in Singapore. Threatened by the direct action of the radical left, they had declared communism illegal. One of many under suspicion was radical leader Lim Chin Siang. Giving a rare interview at his union headquarters, he confronted accusations.
I'm sick to answer this question. This is not the first time I'm being asked the same question. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life to answer this question. I tell you categorically, I'm not a communist.
But in raids across the island, Lim, Fong, and more than 200 left-wing colleagues were arrested. They would not emerge from prison for another 3 years. Unchallenged in his party, Lee Kuan Yew could now prepare for the elections ahead. In June 1959, the PAP swept to power on a tide of mass support. On the steps of City Hall stood the first native-born Singaporean to control the island.
Saudara-saudara, saudari-saudari setanah air, merdeka! Lagi sekali yang bersemangat merdeka!
But from the start, the new Prime Minister had limited room for maneuver.
There was no joy on election night. We knew we were taking office and it was a crown of thorns.
Lee Kuan Yew had managed to hold on to the mass vote, but at a price. During the election campaign, he'd made the people a promise that as Prime Minister, he would release all the leftist prisoners.
We had to release them, or otherwise we'd be seen to be unprincipled people who indulge in skullduggery, use the British to lock up our opponents. So we had to release them, knowing that they're going to fight us. And that fight had to be in the open.
Just hours after the election victory, crowds gathered for the release of Lim, Fong, and 6 other political prisoners.
When we came out, we were received very warmly by the masses. Wherever we went, they lit firecrackers for us.
Lim Chin Siang and his colleagues may have been back in the PAP, but not for long. The party would soon split again, this time irreversibly, over the question of Singapore's future.
170 years of British protection have brought Malaya peacefully to the point where she is ready to manage her own affairs.
As the British had promised after the war, Malaya had been granted full independence in 1957. But Singapore remained a colony. Its new Prime Minister had promised to break free from the British Empire. He believed it could only become independent if it was in a political union with its huge neighbor to the north. But there was a problem. Malaya's leader, Tunku Abdul Rahman, didn't want to upset the existing demographics.
Merdeka! Merdeka! Merdeka!
Malaya was very delicately balanced. The natives, like me, we were almost minority in our country. If you add another 2 million Chinese from Singapore, you will tip the balance completely against the Malays.
The Tunku wasn't interested in the idea of a political union. But across the straits, Lee Kuan Yew continued making the case for a merger between Singapore and Malaya. He went on a charm offensive to win support for the plan.
People living in the many rural parts of Singapore are having a chance to talk direct to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew has covered a large part of the island, talking, questioning and listening.
Merger, stability, security, economic development. If we've got that, then we've got prosperity, the people's welfare.
For the radicals in his party, it was all too much. Their dreams of turning Singapore into a pro-communist stronghold would be destroyed by any merger with Malaya. They came up with a drastic solution. In July 1961, Lim Chin Siong led a mass defection from the PAP. Setting up the far-left Barisan Socialist Party, he campaigned passionately against merger. With the masses flocking to the new banner, the PAP faced total collapse.
We are quite confident if there is a general election, we can beat the government. Well, whether we beat the government, no, but I'm sure the government will be defeated. I'm quite confident for that. We can wait for that.
The radical leftists stood a real chance of unseating Lee Kuan Yew from power. With elections imminent, 3 unlikely bedfellows were brought together by the fear of Singapore becoming a pro-communist enclave. The British colonial rulers, the anti-colonial Chinese Prime Minister, and the Malay leader suspicious of Chinese intentions. The Tunku reluctantly conceded that Singapore could merge with Malaya, but only when unfinished business with the leftists had been taken care of.
In January '63, Tunku decided that he wanted them locked up before he took over. He wanted the burden to be carried by the British. And I said, let's wait until after merger. Tunku says, no, we arrest them now, or there will be no merger.
A final showdown with the pro-communists was imminent.
We had this premonition that sooner or later we would all be detained. It was after 12 midnight. I was in Singapore's Norfolk Road. There was an intense knocking at the door. When I opened it, standing in front of me was my neighbor. He had come to arrest me. He apologized profusely, and I said it was all right. He was just carrying out his duties.
More than 100 left-wing radicals were arrested during Operation Cold Storm, and rioting broke out in protest. But Fong Swee Swan and Lim Chin Siong would remain in political cold storage for the rest of the decade. After attempting suicide, Lim was later sent into exile. Lee Kuan Yew had fulfilled his dream of steering Singapore out of the British Empire and into a merger with Malaya. In September 1963, a new country was born. The S and the I from Singapore were inserted into Malaya to form Malaysia.
Let's get together, sing a happy song, Malaysia forever.
But from being #1 in Singapore, He was now number 2 in Malaysia.
Malaysia's Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, came to declare open the $250,000 UMNO house at Changi Road, Singapore.
The Tunku had a very simple method of reminding everybody who is in charge. So the photographs, the protocol, the solid phalanx of Malays, and a few Chinese and Indians at the periphery.
Later, Tunku signed the visitors' book, assisted by several charming Malay film actresses.
They got along very well at first, but I think Lee Kuan Yew eventually became almost a pest to Tunku. Keep on asking these concessions, and with the Malays, especially with the royal, they don't like people to keep on irritating them.
Behind the personality clash were fundamental political differences, which would soon spill over into racial violence on the streets of Singapore. For the Tunku, merger with Singapore had created a dilemma. The island's industrious Chinese brought much-needed wealth to his country, but they also threatened to overwhelm Malay political power. So he ensured the rights of his fellow Malays were protected in Malaysia's constitution.
We didn't make any demand of Singapore. We said, look, you are part of Malaysia, you behave like one, like all the rest of the states. Singapore was one of the 14 component states, but Singapore was behaving like the prima donna among this, almost with a nation within a nation.
Members of the multiracial PAP leadership opposed the idea of special rights for Malays. They demanded that all Malaysians should be treated equally, whatever their race. The most potent symbol of the PAP's multiracialism was Othman Wok. A Malay who had been to school with Lee Kuan Yew, he was now a minister in his cabinet. In July 1964, he was taking part in a religious procession.
I was leading a PAP Muslim members contingent, about 70 people. I saw Malay youth attacking onlookers on the roadside, Chinese onlookers. And I saw a Chinese old man on a bicycle who was pulled down, he was beaten up, and the bicycle thrown into the river.
Rather than fostering unity, political union had brought about the worst race riots in Singapore's history. By August 1965, the Tunku decided Malay-Chinese relations were beyond repair. He sent a letter to the PAP leadership informing them of his intentions.
Everybody was rather silent, solemn. Kuan Yew was sitting at the table, and then when he saw us, he took this piece of paper. It was a letter written by Tunku in his own handwriting.
They want us out of Malaysia. So I said, are they serious? He said, yes, absolutely. Otherwise there's going to be a bloodbath.
From Kuala Lumpur, the Tunku made a broadcast to his people.
We have had to break away from Singapore. It is the most painful piece of work that I've had to do since I've been the Prime Minister for the last 10 years.
Singapore's path through the 20th century had been traumatic. But the most painful moment of all was fast approaching for one man. He'd set his heart and gambled his credibility on a merger with Malaya, and lost.
You know, every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish.
I had, I suppose, a sense of guilt of having got so many people involved in this problem, and I had to face them.
All my life,
the feelings welled up. It was a difficult emotional problem.
Would you mind if we stop for a while?
Traumatized by the collapse of his dreams, Lee Kuan Yew took refuge in a bungalow retreat far from his seat of power.
The reason was really to get away into a different atmosphere, watch the sea, and ask myself, what do we do now?
Singapore's journey to independence was over. But how would it fare in the turbulent decades ahead?